They say that people make Glasgow. Well, those same people also make a habit of raising their voice when they see injustice. From campaigns against apartheid and the poll tax to Black Lives Matter, Glasgow is a city synonymous with protest. Pandemic allowing, its people will do so again, this time for climate justice. In the first 2 weeks of November, the UN talks known as COP-26 arrive in the city known as the Dear Green Place. They are some of the most significant global climate talks ever held, and they'll also add a critical new chapter to a story in which Glasgow has featured prominently before. It is, after all, the place where the inventor James Watt made important enhancements to the steam engine. It would be wrong to blame a man who died more than 200 years ago for the world's climate ills today, but Watt's discoveries helped catalyse an industrial revolution that resulted in the burning of climate-changing fossil fuels. More than 2 centuries on, the Glasgow talks will now help determine whether the world can prevent already dangerous climate change from becoming disastrous. In recent days, the task facing the negotiators from 196 countries when they meet in Glasgow has become clearer than ever, with hundreds of scientists presenting their latest findings on the impact of humans on the planet. The UN has branded their report a code red for humanity. More extreme weather events, more droughts, more floods. Some climate impacts are now irreversible. Yet ever-rising global temperatures aren't inevitable. And as home to the host city for these talks, Scotland will never have a better chance to inspire the faster global climate action that's so urgently needed. But is Scotland's own climate record strong enough to do so? The answer? A tentative yes. Scotland's emissions have more than halved since 1990, driven by shifts away from coal, and they continue to fall. With climate change a devolved power, the Scottish Parliament has set amongst the strongest legal climate emissions targets of any developed country. Scotland's committed to cutting emissions by 75% by 2030 and to achieve so-called net zero by 2045. That's 5 years earlier than the UK as a whole. On the face of it then, Scotland has a relatively strong story to tell. Yet history will not judge Scotland's commitment to climate justice on ambitious promises. It will do so on whether emissions actually fall at the speed and scale that's needed. And here, the record is very far from perfect. The 2019 emissions cut target was missed, completing an unwanted hat-trick of annual targets missed in a row. The Scottish Government has promised to catch up, but it's critical that Scotland's climate plan is now urgently revisited and strengthened before the 2030 target moves firmly out of reach. Meeting this target will involve change, lots of it, for individuals, for communities, and for the industries that serve them. That much is clear and unavoidable. Take oil and gas, a sector of huge importance to Scotland. Change won't come easily, but it's no less essential. Yet, despite the UN Secretary-General saying the latest scientific findings must mark the death knell for fossil fuels, there are damaging plans to give the go-ahead to pull yet more oil from a new field off the coast of Shetland. The decision rests with the UK government, and the Prime Minister should intervene and block the proposal. The First Minister's call for him to review it is therefore welcome, but she too should now make her own opposition clear. Because while in other circumstances aiming high but falling gallantly short can perhaps be excused, the climate crisis affords no such luxury. A failure to cut emissions in line with what science demands costs lives. This deadly reality is reflected in the Scottish Government's welcome recognition that those who are impacted by climate change first and worst are those who did least to cause it and are also least able to cope with its impacts. Scotland's Climate Justice Fund supports impacted communities to adapt to their changing climate. The recent pledge to double the fund after a 5-year freeze is a timely, though partial, recognition of Scotland's past and current emissions, and a very welcome contribution to plugging the major gap in climate finance globally. The government must implement this rise quickly. After all, the UN Secretary-General warns that the success of COP-26 rests on rich countries rebuilding trust by delivering long-promised but under-delivered financial support. And so the First Minister approaches COP26 with a relatively strong, though imperfect, story to tell. Her government is now sharing it through what's known globally as an NDC, a nationally determined contribution. As part of the UK, Scotland isn't required to set out its contribution to tackling the climate crisis. The decision to do so voluntarily is therefore a very welcome attempt to inspire faster global action. Of course, to be credible, the Scottish Government must, at an absolute minimum, show it's delivering the emission cuts it promises, and, like all rich nations, it must be honest that it needs to do more. As the UK Committee on Climate Change says, Scotland must earn its stripes as an international climate leader. Globally, too many governments and corporations are hiding behind unreliable, unproven and unrealistic schemes to remove carbon from the atmosphere as the basis for their net zero targets. Scotland cannot let our ambitious promises become a smokescreen for dirty business as usual. But as Scotland does more to credibly rise to this challenge, the government should also do everything in its power before and during COP to use its relatively strong example to inspire faster progress globally, and it must place the priorities of impacted communities at the core of its message. The government's decision to therefore co-host so-called Glasgow climate dialogues before COP to amplify those priorities offers another important example. Scotland may be small, but the message of climate hope and action it can send to the world is significant. It's then up to the countries of the world to realise that hope in Glasgow.